So I think hearing that yoga isn't that old, and hearing that it's a synthesis of, like Marx, to quote Marx's book again, the kind of that it has some, or Joseph Alter's wrestling has a little bit of wrestling in there, and it has a little bit of a harmonial gymnastics in there, right? And aspects of bodybuilding coming from Muller, and different influences there. I mean, how did you feel about that? Because I mean, for a lot of people, that's pretty much being told that Father Christmas doesn't exist. I mean, that's and we all need myths to function. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we all need serving kind of ideals. I think
So for me. Yeah. For me at that time when that book came out, it was huge for me, but it really confirmed in many ways what I had already really been sensing, and it gave voice to what I had kind of been seeing and experiencing, and as this huge gap between what yoga teachers were saying, what they were doing, and what I was starting to, in my own kind of even amateur research at that time, able to tease out and find in the texts, through translations at that time. So already I had an undergraduate degree in religious studies. I had gone to India in search of the true, authentic, pure yoga, the ancient yoga. If I could just find, that Swami in the cave.
You had that idealism. Yeah, that's nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Well, there was some naivete still there. There was idealism. At the same time, I had a critical bullshit filter that was given to me by my undergraduate professors. So I knew how to discern between, a lot of just the hogwash and BS. I knew enough to know when somebody was sort of just making stuff up. But at the same time, I still wanted to believe. There was something, truly ancient and old. But you know what? As I say that, it's not that yoga is not ancient and old. And it's not that in India today that you don't experience things that have this living history of, 2,000+ years. That is the beautiful and intoxicating thing about, Indian culture and even contemporary India, right? But yet it's not just this simplistic, there was this ancient, pure, original yoga, and that intact has been passed down in this parampara from guru to student all the way down to the present day. The story is far more complex. It's far more interesting than that, frankly.
Yeah,
there's so much more development and innovation. And how could there not, really, if you look at any human cultural tradition, something over 2,000 years of time, it's going to change, it's going to adapt. And so the same with yoga. So it's not that you can't find old practices or teachings in India. That would be really silly if somebody was saying that. At the same time, what I experienced in India in those first trips was this sort of pizza effect thing, where the yoga that I was experiencing, especially in places like Rishikesh and Haridwar, even in Varanasi, and this kind of Dharma trail, where there's a lot of Western yogis traveling, going in search of this authentic Indian yoga, that the yoga that was being kind of fed to me was very much Westernized, right? And the yoga that's being taught has kind of been processed in this intercultural feedback loop, right? So it has the Indian cultural elements, it has some of the older stuff, but the way even a modern postural yoga class is sequenced, and the type of asanas that are being done, the opening and closing rituals of a yoga class today, right? These are things that are much newer.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I'm just trying to think this through myself, really, and think, well, what does it matter what we're doing if we're trying to embody ourselves? But then it's like, well, that's a very modern way to look at yoga, to kind of, as a kind of therapeutic, semi-therapeutic kind of system of kind of synthesizing your ego or your sense of self in the world as a, in a collective context, in a social context. So was I thinking of that? No, it was probably a little bit deeper, right? So probably what I was thinking subconsciously, although I hadn't really actually questioned it that much, was my yoga practice was going back to something tantric, like an idea of working with an energy in the body. And that was related in Ashtanga yoga to a certain sequence of movements in a certain combination with a certain breathing, right? So the movements in themselves had an energetic quality. Each movement had, I'm explaining it to you now, it had a symbolic, energetic quality. And the linking up of that system in a particular order with a breath also did that as well. And so therefore it was important, for it to have a valid tantric nature that was kind of true, in a way, and it had a pedigree and it had a background, and of course, latterly we know that, yes, the yoga is tantric, but it seems like there's a tantra that basically never, as Daniela was saying, is never going to be shared. And it's not involving a magic combination of a certain sequence of postures or energy contained in a certain bodily shape. It's, as I understood it from Daniela, and the sadhus that were doing it, it's a lot deeper than that. This tantric element, which is there as a background of the movement, is going a lot deeper.
Yeah. What I would say is, like in India today, you kind of have this yoga culture that is very much influenced by the Western postural yoga culture.
Yeah.
With studios and trainings and retreats and all of that. And that's really, really directly influenced by this modern postural yoga thing that Mark really kind of outlines the genesis of in Yoga Body. But then there's the sadhus and the ascetics. As Daniela's work shows, they too are, of course, being influenced by globalized discourse. They're on social media. They're consuming all of this content as well. Perhaps listening to this podcast, who knows?
Absolutely, yeah.
But their yoga and what they conceive of as yoga is quite different than the kind of postural yoga studio retreat culture. The other thing is, you were talking about the relationship between Tantra and postural yoga, and this is a complicated subject, I think. We mentioned that Hatha yoga's roots are perhaps in some of these Buddhist tantric ritual contexts. Hatha yoga, we have the Amrita Siddhi, this tantric Buddhist text, which teaches some of the methods for the first time, but then it's in these Shiva kind of Natha texts where it's called Hatha yoga for the first time, perhaps in the 12th, 13th century. And then there's a proliferation of different texts that start to teach Hatha yoga. And there's different traditions that are writing those texts. So one of them is the Virashaivas in South India, and that's they wrote the Shiva Yoga Pradipika. They may have, the author of the Hatha Pradipika, we now think it may have been, if not Virashaiva, influenced by Virashaiva communities at Sri Shailam, this great temple and pilgrimage site of the Siddhas in Andhra. These texts, though, and these communities, I would not say are explicitly tantric. And in fact, in many ways, they're moving away from some of the esotericism and secrecy of Tantra, in particular, the use of mantra and other complex rituals. Mm-hmm. And they're focusing their energy on the body, that's a pun. And focusing on the methods and the techniques, of Hatha and Raja yoga. Now, there's still very strong tantric influences in many of those texts, right? Especially an understanding of the energetic body, what you were referring to. So chakras and adaras, nadis, and things like that, which some of the Hatha texts include, some of them don't. But philosophically, and even in terms of the religious and sectarian context of those texts and those systems of yoga, I would differentiate them from kind of like classical tantra and the real tantric lineages, which require a very special diksha and initiation from a guru, and orient around the tantras and agamas, those tantric scriptures, and those very specific tantric practices and communities. So, I mean, at a certain point, everything gets influenced by Tantra, actually. And many of the Hatha and Raja yoga texts philosophically are more non-dual. in that they kind of describe a metaphysics of a union of, the Atman and Paramatman, if they're using Vedantic language, or Shiva and Shakti, or some kind of union of opposites. They don't really adopt that dualistic Sankhya yoga model of the separation of Purusha and Prakriti, for example, that we find in the earlier Patanjali tradition. In many regards, most of the yoga texts and traditions kind of did away with that at a certain point, actually. So it's interesting, though, that then when you get to all the way to Krishnamacharya and his teachings, and he's really he's an orthodox Sri Vaishnava Brahmin, which is not a Tantra. It's not a Tantric.
No. Yeah.
And he has a very specific, religious tradition that he came from. And so he is systematizing all of these things in a new way, and perhaps for a new audience. And there's certain moments where you can tell in his writings and things, he's like, this is too tantric, and this is too, it doesn't fit.
Take it back a bit now.
And a lot, we see this a lot actually in the Hatha Yoga text with some of these mudras, like Vajroli mudra and so forth, right? So the Tantra and Hatha Yoga conversation is, it's nuanced and it's complicated, and there's always been influences, but we can't necessarily say that Hatha Yoga was a tantric tradition, and at the same time, our earliest references to it are in some of these Buddhist tantras. So I hope that made some sense.
As some kind of rejoinder, I would say evidently, yes, it is complicated, and for our general viewership, listenership, rewind that and play it again. Because it is complicated, and people like Seth and other scholars that we've interviewed obviously know it well. But the texts are complicated and nuanced and multitudinous and conflictive. And I mean, there's a lot to it. But to bring it back to maybe a more simplistic level, to which or a level I'm probably more suited, I would say, it comes out of questioning, well, what the hell am I doing in this, we call it these days, and it's a coinage that comes down to Mark and Elizabeth, modern MPY, modern posture, goes an acronym now, modern postural yoga class. Well, what the hell am I doing here? And what am I spending these precious, hour and a half, 2 hours on exactly, right? And if it's physical, then, well, a lot of these postures don't seem to be doing that much. I could probably get a better conditioning down the gym, so there's this question that was in my head as well. Okay, well, the justification was, okay, well, it's something symbolic. It's something, that's kind of inner, an inner transformation happening. It's certainly not. I mean, when we talk to Jim, he goes and traces the line back of early kind of Hatha yoga, although it's not called that, towards ascetic practices, hanging upside down from a tree, or standing on one leg, etc.
I think there's an initial response from many people when you read Yoga Body for the first time, and if you until that moment you had a preconceived notion that your yoga practice that you were doing, that this downward facing dog, was 2,000 years old, 5,000 years old.
But as
there was some value. There was value in that for you, in feeling like you're connecting to something ancient through this practice, right? It's tried and tested. People have achieved some form of enlightenment or transcendence, liberation through this very downward dog pose. If I can just align my shoulders and my hips in the correct, proper way, right? That there is a right way to do this, and if I do this, then it'll click in. I mean, there is some seriousness to that, right? That there is this proper way to do it. What we'd call, in religious studies, you talk about orthodoxy of view, of belief. That there is a proper or right view, a true view of reality. But in a bodily religion, we might talk about orthopraxy, the proper way to practice. That there is, and different modern yoga schools have different orthopraxies, right? And yogis will debate vehemently about the proper alignment in Trikonasana, and so on and so forth. And that there is soteriological value in that. That is to say, there's actually a spiritual effect that the proper alignment will have. I mean, that's often how we're trained in postural yoga, that the proper alignment is going to have, open the body energetically in the most suitable or ideal way, so on and so forth. That it's not just meaningless details, that all of this kind of fits together within this broader postural system. So the point I want to make is that there is a natural response, I feel like, if you're trained in that, if you view your practice in that way, that there's a right way, and that this right way is ancient. And then all of a sudden you're told Santa Claus doesn't exist. Or you're told, no, actually, this stuff is not ancient. And you might even think, oh, this stuff was made up within 100 years. All of a sudden you think, what the hell am I doing? What have I been doing? You sort of start to forget about all of the positive effects that maybe this practice has even had on your body, on your mind, on your life, on your relationships. The first thing is that it's not that it was all made up. Some of it has more modern influences, we know. Some of these poses are older than others.
I mean, interesting. I wanted to just mention in another podcast you pointed out that downward dog is there's no mention of downward dog as a posture anywhere. I think you said, like in the Pradipika or anywhere, we don't get downward dog, which is the most endemic posture of yoga. So that's kind of ironic.
Colleagues, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone's listening, but to my knowledge, in no Sanskrit text is there a reference, pre-modern Sanskrit text to Adho Mukha Svanasana, or Urdhva Mukha Svanasana for that matter, an upward facing dog. Now this is where it starts to get a little tricky, Adam, is that, in a text like the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati, this manual for practice on Hatha, which Jason Birch and Mark Singleton date to somewhere late 17th, early 18th century. So still a more recent text. That text actually does have some sequences of yoga postures, and I forget the name of the posture off the top of my head right now, because there's over 100 postures in that text, in fact. But there's something that kind of resembles, more of a downward facing dog, but it's not certainly not called that. Those alignment principles are, non-existent. It's certainly not the same as what we think of as that modern pose, and it's a different context, in fact. So, it's an interesting question, is like, has a human being who identified as a yogi put himself in that shape before over the past 2,000 years? Has a yogi ever, stretched his body facing downward like a dog in 2,000 years? Possibly, but that doesn't mean that there was this specific asana within a yoga context that was called that and performed within a yoga framework.
And I think, to go back to Joseph Alter again, I think he cheekily suggests that this sequence is slightly related to the wrestling maneuvers, the kind of dance wrestling.
That's possible. That's one theory. Yeah.
It's a theory, isn't it?
There's definitely does seem to be some martial connections with like Surya Namaskara.
I don't know. Maybe we're just. Another thing is, like, as you mentioned originally. We're in the process of evolution as a society, as what we're doing with yoga in the first place. We're not using yoga, as sadhus in the medieval period of time, right? We don't have a worldview that's related to that. The original roots of this tradition, it's ascetic, I believe. It's transcendental. It's saying, well, this, the life is suffering. Basically, so life is suffering, and we want to get out of it, as by basically denying our body and denying the gunas, right? And modern postural yoga and the way people are taking it in the classroom now, to cut a long story short, is for a very different objective, right? Which is a valid objective in the current way that we're viewing in relation to our worldview.
Well, I think people do yoga today for all sorts of reasons. I think there's a general public
probably not to deny the world
influencer,
as
probably
a
not. Probably not, but as you know, in the Ashtanga yoga community, and those who go to India, I mean among yogis, there are more, let's say, hardcore. There are more ascetic types.
Yes, that was a kind
within
of
the yoga
yes,
community.
Yes,
so
indeed. Yeah,
I'm always just skeptical when people say, "Oh, the West does yoga for health and beauty," and that.
Right.
Like, well. Many of them do, and it's not just the West. Most of the people doing yoga in India today at urban centers in Mumbai or Delhi are doing yoga to lose weight or to, have a better sex life or to whatever the physical or mental health benefit may be.
It's
not limited
it's not that we
to
superficialize yoga because we're Western and we can't do things seriously. I suppose I'm more suggesting that, well, it's not an ascetic practice that we're probably wanting to do, most of us anymore. And it's not a tantric practice in the way that, the reading of some of your work and many other people that we've mentioned here, we're not doing that either. Let's be quite honest. That's pretty serious stuff, and it's secretive and it's taught, it's not really in the text. There's suggestions and there's sun moons and there's all kinds of, bringing the nectar down and bringing the bindu up, or etc., whatever. We're not doing.
I know there's a lot of yoga teachers who do speak that kind of language.
Right, they do.
In their classes, don't you think?
Yeah. Maybe I wouldn't like to be in a class where that was being suggested. Really, I think my filter might explode. My own BS filter might explode there.
I'm in California here, so
right. You've got a higher tolerance to BS there, maybe. But I'm English, and I probably would have walked out of that class.
Oh no! Don't get it confused. I am not taking those classes.
Weren't you? That was where you
struggle. I struggle. It's been an interesting relationship myself with that kind of yoga over these years, as I've learned more and more and more. It's sort of like nails on a chalkboard to be in a postural yoga class like that, where I hear someone talking about the chakras or something like that.
I suppose I'm just Socratically questioning, right? Like, why am I here? And I'm a teacher, and that's still my my calling, my vocation, my profession, whatever you want to call it, So why am I here? What am I doing? And what's it good for? What am I actually trying to engender, in another person's, or help facilitate in another person's experience, right? If there's not some tantric mystical awakening in it, and I don't want them probably to flagellate themselves as some kind of penance, then, but is it simply that, just to make oneself feel a bit calmer? I think it's more than that. I think we have this yearning, gaping hole for something more existentially fulfilling, still. And we lost, as you've lost, we've lost, all of us have lost a kind of cultural relationship with old religions, Judeo-Christian background, in the West. And we're looking for something else. So, I think someone needs to write this book on how, the various intentions and aims towards our modern yoga class, in the lay language that people can understand, perhaps.
Well, I think that sounds like a book for you to write, Adam. You interview all your guests, all these guests.
I've been bloody trying to write a book.
You would write it in a language that would be readable for you and certainly your listeners and many others. But hey, I did want to say this though.
Please.
This questioning of what you're doing in a yoga class, I think, is really important, and I think the positive spinoff, I think, and how the yoga scholarship, I hope, filters into the yoga community in a positive way, is with a more honest, more transparent internal questioning along all of these lines. If we say, okay, so this is not 2,000 years old, this is not 5,000 years old, so where did this come from? Why did they do it? Why did yogis do this in pre-modern India? What were their goals? What was the context? What are we doing today? Why is this important? Is this alignment principle so important for me to achieve enlightenment? Or can I maybe take a break during this asana and I'll be okay?
Yeah.
Maybe let go a little bit of clinging to that orthopraxy. Maybe there's not just one way to do this yoga thing. Maybe I can study with other teachers. Maybe I can try different traditions. I hope that it's an invitation to want to learn more about what this yoga is, what it has been, what we're doing today, where it's going. So that's really where I hope yogic studies as a platform comes in, and where I see it making an impact, because so many of the students taking courses with us, with these scholars, many of whom we've mentioned today, they've had that moment. They've read something, or they've wanted to go deeper. They wanted to study the Yoga Sutras or Hatha Pradipika. They wanted to learn some Sanskrit. Now they kind of have an online place to turn where they can get very reliable training, where you don't have to go to Harvard or Oxford and shell out all that money or become a PhD or an academic, but yet you can get access to these teachings, to this research, and you can start to kind of piece the puzzle together for yourself, and you can start to answer those questions by really deeply and honestly exploring yoga's past, its roots, and trying to make sense then of what you are doing today in lieu of this history. And what I think we find if you start taking these courses is this incredible depth, this richness, the value that you were talking about that in many ways is sort of missing in modern society. You can explore these practices and ideas that are all aimed at alleviating suffering in some capacity, but you can see the diversity across texts, across traditions, across religions, that there was no single yoga, right? That the Buddhists were doing yoga. Hindus of all stripes, Shaivas, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, right? Jains, Sikhs, even Islamic Sufis, right? We're all doing various types of yoga in pre-modern India.
The questions that it throws up are actually, finally, once you've, got over perhaps the initial disappointment, the questions and are actually more, enrich the yoga practice, in the end. They can kind of give more texture, more nuances to actually what we're doing. And as Seth wrapped up the podcast quite nicely with, go and check out yoga studies and do a little bit of, thinking around the box, because once, you don't need to necessarily know Sanskrit. Obviously Seth, kind of into Sanskrit and does the courses as well, which are very popular, I hear. But, just a little bit of thinking around your yoga practice and not necessarily accepting, just the old story really, just adds so much more in my own experience to what we're doing, even if it's not an answered conclusion, but rather actually an open, evolving question. So I suppose on that note, Seth, I would say we didn't debate at a very high academic level, and you'll find, as I said, a much more rigorous entertainment of these questions within Seth's platform, Yogic Studies. But nevertheless, I really have appreciated our conversation today, and I hope the listenership have too. Please comment, like, subscribe, and do whatever you want to do on YouTube to hear more of this stuff. Thank you, Seth.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone.